So today is going to be our first day reading Ruth and the Green Book, and it is a historical fiction book. Here's the cover of Ruth and the Green Book. It was written by Calvin Alexander Ramsey with Gwen Strauss, and the illustrations were done by Floyd Cooper. Now, if you look at the picture, you can see a girl with her mother, and she's holding a book that says Green Book. You'll also see that they're at a gas station, and it looks like that's the gas attendant and possibly her father. Here, you have a picture of the car that they're driving as well. Now, before we read the book, it's important to get some background history on the time period that this took place in. So it is really important for us to learn some background before we read historical fiction. So we are actually not reading this book today. After today, you're going to be able to understand the time period the book takes place in, the historical conflicts that our character Ruth and her family may face, and how the time period will affect the character's actions, choices, and decisions. Today I'm going to share with you the back of the book, which talks about the history of the Motorist Green Book. You'll notice right here is the Motorist Green Book. Decades after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment ended slavery, African Americans continued to suffer unequal treatment, especially in the South, where Jim Crow laws discriminated against Blacks in nearly every aspect of public life, including travel. Although the roads and highways were free for all to use, doing so was not easy for Blacks. Most hotels and restaurants would not serve African Americans, and driving overnight often meant sleeping in cars and packing food to eat during the journey. Many gas stations would not sell gas to Black drivers, so they had to carry gas cans and always be on the lookout for the few stations that would welcome their business. Even then, they might not be allowed to use a public restroom. In 1936, an African American living in New York City named Victor Green wrote a book to help Black travelers. He made a list of all the hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and businesses that would serve African Americans in his city. There was such a high demand for his book that he decided his next edition would include other towns in other states as well. The Green Book was sold for $0.25 in 1940 at Black-owned businesses and at Esso stations, which were among the only gas stations that sold to African Americans. Esso was owned by the Standard Oil Company, which eventually provided funding and offices for Victor Green. The Green Book quickly became very popular and helped many businessmen on the road, as well as the families who needed and wanted to travel by car. By 1949, the price of the Green Book had grown along with its size. It cost 75 cents and was 80 pages. It covered all of the United States, Bermuda, Mexico, and Canada. In the 1950s and early 1960s, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. brought national and international recognition to the injustices suffered by African Americans. Jim Crow's days were outnumbered. On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. Among other things, this act made it illegal for hotels, restaurants, and gas stations to discriminate against customers. Victor Green published the final edition of the Green Book that same year, 1964. His lifelong dream to see African American travelers treated equally was finally a reality. So I found online a couple of copies of certain parts of the Green Book. Here is information about Fort Worth. And if you look here, it has hotels where Black people were able to stay, restaurants where they were served, beauty parlors, and service stations like gas stations. You'll notice that over the years, the list does grow, and the font changes and information might change. Next, we're going to read the back blurb from Ruth and the Green Book. Ruth was so excited to take a trip in her family's new car. In the early 1950s, few African Americans could afford to buy cars, so this would be an adventure. But she soon found out that Black travelers weren't treated very well in some towns. Many hotels and gas stations refused service to Black people. Daddy was upset about something called Jim Crow laws. Finally, a friendly attendant at a gas station showed Ruth's family the Green Book. It listed all of the places that would welcome Black travelers. With this guidebook and the kindness of strangers, Ruth could finally make a safe journey from Chicago to her grandmother's house in Alabama. Ruth's story is fiction, but the Green Book and its role in helping a generation of African American travelers avoid some of the terrible effects of Jim Crow are a historical fact. So today you're going to be answering specific questions about the video lesson that you just watched today. The first thing you're going to answer is what time period does this book take place in? So I want you to give me a date. Then you're going to describe 2 things that you learned about this time period. Based on the video lesson, what conflicts might Ruth face along her journey from Chicago to Alabama? Please use complete sentences there. Your last question, and make sure you scroll to the second page, is why did Victor Green stop making the Green Book? Tomorrow we'll actually start reading the book, but the purpose of today was to understand the history before we start reading the historical fiction book.